And Margaret Race, Lunar Environmental Management, Science Input Needed for Guiding Development of Lunar Exploration and Use Policies.
Thank you.
Take it away, Margaret.
Hi. Okay, so this is something different. If I go back through the reason for having this workshop, it's to produce a set of priority targets. I was thinking that maybe you'd all begin to prioritize them, but that's okay. Just producing them is good enough. Primarily, but not exclusively, from the commercial exploration firms, thinking about target areas that we all can use for science later on. And it's intended to stimulate discussion about specific targets that we're going to go to. And the idea is to come up with some prioritization for science-focused payloads. So everything is really science on all of this. But I want to take a little bit of a longer view, because even though you're thinking about how do you map out your science, you want to think about the context, the larger context, which is exploration and use of lunar environment. And the context is in the Outer Space Treaty and other guides and frameworks that are being put together by others, not in this community. And we want to think about sustainability, balanced plans, and precautionary approach in the long run, working together and recognizing that there are gaps as we go ahead. So in preparing for this, I came across the Lunar Exploration Roadmap, which really is impressive. And it's looking at exploring the moon in the coming century and thinks about themes and objectives, goals, priorities, and it's got a time frame in it. And we're looking at science exploration, that middle one. But the cross-cutting themes for all of them are to think about living and working on other worlds, expanding our economic sphere to include the moon, pursuing activities that would benefit everybody, and strengthen and create global partnerships, which we're seeing here, and of course, educating and inspiring the public. So the science exploration is what we're talking about, and you can see all of the things that the scientists are interested in. And myself, I'm thinking the bottom one, the lunar environment, is a research tool for thinking forward to, for instance, missions to Mars. When you talk about how do you take your samples and seal them up and bring them back, that has implications for Mars missions and contamination of a different sort, microbial, that could be limited when you come back to and do sample returns. So there's all sorts of things that we can gain, and the feeding forward to Mars and elsewhere and the sustainability are something that are later. That's in a later phase of your roadmap. Oh, wrong way. So I want to have you think in a bigger picture. All of our activities in space come in under the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 that applies to both governments and non-government entities, so the commercial folks that are here. COSPAR is often I come and talk about planetary protection, and COSPAR, the scientific body, treats the moon as Category 2. Lucky you, no operational constraints on in situ activities or sample return. Go for it. What you need, though, is documentation and categorization letter. You do have to interact with the Planetary Protection Office, and you're describing the mission profile, the end of mission, extensions of missions, things like that, and any organics over a kilogram. And that does have, all of this does have implications, because with the Lunar Prospector mission, when it's smacked into the moon deliberately to look for volatiles, ices, that was a decision that had to be made to be okay. And we have to think beyond just our community, because the Navajo Nation, which believes the moon is sacred, was very upset about that. So here we are going to do good science, but another stakeholder, a public stakeholder, is saying, wait a minute, that may not be a good thing to do. And they are just as much part of the United Nations and all of our international community. We also have scientists involved in COSPAR PEX, Planetary Exploration Panel. And in 2010, the PEX group, which was separated kind of off from Planetary Protection, said we need to have a framework to protect outer space environments and provide consistent and predictable legal landscape for commercial space endeavors. And since that time, there have been 3 workshops, really good workshops, looking at how you do a stepping stone approach to approaching this idea of having a predictable legal landscape. The IAA has, in 2010, also did a major piece looking at protecting the environments of celestial bodies. The International Institute of Space Law in 2009 was talking about claims to lunar property rights. NASA did a report on the Google Lunar X Prize, the first time we started talking about access to the landed sites that are up on the moon. And it was the anthropologists and historians that were saying, wait a minute, if these Lunar X Prizes and such can land there and go over and take a piece of a human heritage site, that's not a good thing. What if it ends up on eBay? But what did the scientists want to do? Go over to the lunar sites, take off a piece, and bring it home and look at space weathering and other things. So how do you adjudicate these? How do you put them all together? UN COPUOS in 2010 onwards has a working group looking at long-term sustainability of space, and they're saying let's develop some voluntary norms. It can be done instead of, or in addition to, or until the lawyers get around to it, having legal norms. But if you look at it, it's mostly space debris, low Earth orbit, geostationary orbit satellites, and nobody's done anything for any of the planetary bodies yet. And UN COPUOS is also looking at a Hague Space Research Governance Working Group, and they've been working since 2016. Identification and formulation of building blocks for the governance of space resources, and recommendations on implementation strategy and a forum for negotiations on international agreements for non-legally binding instruments. So even while you're thinking about prioritizing science, others are thinking about a lot of other things that could have an impact on the science. So today, as we're looking at it, peaceful exploration and use for the benefit of mankind, that's what the Outer Space Treaty says. And we can see that there's potential conflicts, societal concerns, and definitely policy gaps that are out there. For exploration and science, we've got all sorts of nice priority plans, but for uses and all other activities, we got nothing. The Outer Space Treaty is mute on resource utilization and environmental management when it comes to the moon. No code of conduct or environmental impact statement approach, environmental assessment, and already people are proposing that. International areas have no sovereignty, so whose rules play? There's no oversight of enforcement, so it's all kind of voluntary norms. It's considered a soft law approach. I tell you, we will do it this way, but nobody's out there with a badge telling you you can't. And so what is the nature of sustainability or stewardship when we look at something like the moon? You know, to a biologist like me, it's a rock, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so when you look at the Outer Space Treaty, it looks like this. In low Earth orbit and geostationary orbit, there's lots of stakeholders, lots of legal issues, and lots of legal compliance issues that are played out in courts and international discussions. If you look at the moon and celestial bodies, what you got is planetary protection so far. That's all. Nothing else on environmental use, environmental management claims, rights, multiple stakeholders. Timeframes. What's the time frame we're talking about here? So what's ahead is questions about use and development. It's not just government and NASA and the agencies that are here. We've got commercial involved in it. And there's lots of plans that have been mentioned in many journals and articles. Google Lunar X Prize was one of the first ones that came up. LUNX is talking commercial payloads, bases, moon bases and Mars bases, infrastructure, but what do you do about waste disposal and power supplies? That's coming up. Spaceports, mineral and resource uses, in situ resource utilization, collection of rare minerals, this is on asteroids and such. Astroburials, advertisements, can you do a Nike swish in a big visible crater? Tourism, astro-adventurism, far-side telescopes, oh, why should the scientist have the backside and nobody else? Communications infrastructure, that'll take a little bit of work too. Terraforming and large-scale changes. And who's got rights on all of these things? So this is an appeal to you workshop participants. As you think about landing sites and all the science priorities, you should also consider how that information might fit into mixed-use guidelines for exploration. What goes into it? You haven't even gotten around to the bloody fights about who's going to be doing which site first. Well, now you add other people who aren't even in the room, okay? How do you think about multidisciplinarity on something like the moon? What kind of straw man framework would work? NASA's really good at putting up straw man frameworks and then poking holes at it. And maybe that's what we can do after this. What criteria do you use on something like the moon? When I think about Mars, I can take my biology and talk about bio, geochemical, physical, and all of that. There's no bio up there. So all the criteria we use for sustainability and stewardship in laws and guidelines and regulations here on Earth don't apply. So what is going to be the criterion that's the most important? And the timelines and the environments of concerns. What's more important, looking at volatiles or looking at subsurface things? Do you want to look at South Pole Aitken Basin or someplace else? So consider scientific criteria for environmental protection. Of all the things you're talking about, are there some that fit in? Are there places that are considered off limits? Are there places that would be okay for blended uses? Are there places where there shouldn't be any restrictions? You could build a Manhattan there if you wanted. I don't know. I don't know, given the science priorities. But what do you think about science protection and environmental concerns? They're kind of two different things, but they blend together. And they also foretell resource management. Because again, it's a non-habitable environment. It's a category 2 in terms of the only legal restrictions we have. And so how did you balance stakeholder interest now and in the intermediate and in the long term, especially since the moon is our nearest neighbor, and we're looking at it all the time. So perhaps you have to start thinking about your environmental and management and your science priorities like you do on Antarctica or other unusual habitats. Again, we still use life as our descriptor, but even undersea, international law, the only 3 places where we have international law like this is Antarctica, the law of the sea, and the Outer Space Treaty. And so what do we do undersea, manganese nodules, other things, or protecting those wonderful, the black smokers and the environments around those? How do you think about that? Or deserts or volcanoes as a resource? Or, I mean, really, the Grand Canyon is rocks, ladies and gentlemen, with a river going through it. But it's more than that. So what are the criteria that you would use? So while I'm saying think outside the box, and while you're thinking about landing sites and science, consider what key information might be needed for policy areas. I don't know. Think outside the agenda. This is an invitation for you guys. Turns out the poster that I was going to present about knowledge gaps for Mars has to be pulled off because the report isn't done. I'll stand at my site and think about let's have an informal discussion. I think that you guys can pull together some strawman guidelines, even though you don't want to prioritize. And I'll do it over refreshments or stand at my poster. And plan ahead. There's 2 wonderful opportunities coming ahead. COSPAR will have its next assembly in Pasadena in 2018. And the one in Istanbul was canceled in 2016 because of a coup and a bombing at the airport. So this is the first time we've been doing something for 4 years. And there'll be a PEX session. And Chris McKay, who is the, in the back of the room, who is the co-chair of the PEX session, will be happy to think about entertaining maybe a panel or something that flows from this meeting. And Unispace Plus 50 is coming up in Vienna, 50 years since the first United Nations conference on the exploration and peaceful uses of outer space. And that one is to consider future course of global space cooperation for the benefit of humankind and to build a comprehensive Space 2030 agenda for the contribution of space activities to the achievement of sustainable development goals. And if this community can't be a part of that, something's wrong. That's all I have to say. Thanks. Any questions? Usually they just get rid of me.
No, we're not getting rid of you yet.
Okay.
Yeah, Martin Elvis, Harvard-Smithsonian, one more time. I totally agree with all this. I want to point out that there's quite a lot of very restricted areas or numbers of particularly interesting craters, like for the places on the moon. The lunar pits are not very numerous so far as we know yet. The number of craters on the far side of the moon that are big enough to put a proper cosmology telescope in are very small in number. And if there are uses for the moon other than science, it won't be the scientists who decide which one they get to use. So better if we start now pulling together all these requirements and trying to have an informal, at least science agreement on what we think we need. And I just happen to have a poster on this. It's poster number 10. Thank you.
Well, as often is the case, I'm an outlier on this, and I recommend that if you want a more conservative view of this whole thing, go to Chapter 12 in my book, Return to the Moon. I
Okay.
find the Outer Space Treaty very permissive for the things that we want to do, and you have to be, it depends on the licensing of activities by the United States government or any other signatory to the Outer Space Treaty. And I just suggest if you get too deep into these weeds, you're not going to do anything. And that's what you have to be careful of. It's,
The biologist in me would have some discussions with you, because
Well, I
you
know
say
you-
the same
I know
thing
you
about
would.
deserts or other places on Earth, and, yeah.
I know you would. We're talking about with respect to the moon, a body that does not have biology unless you take it there. And in the case of Mars, the surface biology is probably non-existent. We're going to get into the same kind of discussions we had before Apollo, in that you end up quarantining crews for no reason. Now, if you want to drill into the surface of Mars and get down to a stable water-ice interface zone, then you have another question.
I would just
but you
respond
deal with
for
that
the
as you get
no-reason
to it.
part. When you come in at re-entry, it's USDA and Center for Disease Control and other agencies that ask questions, what are you
That-
importing?
And that was
is
the big
reason.
mistake. That was the big mistake NASA made.
Spoken as a geologist.
Wow. Yeah, we definitely need refreshments to discuss this. Are we going to?